Charlie Parker was just a widowed mechanic drowning in debt who pulled over in the rain to fix an old woman's stalled Lincoln for free. He didn't know the woman was the mother of a billionaire auto CEO, and he definitely didn't know that the sabotage device he pulled from her engine was built using the exact same code used to frame and destroy his career 11 years ago, by the time the CEO's daughter dragged him into her corporate lab as a disposable contractor. Charlie realized a multi-billion-dollar autonomous car was about to kill its test drivers, and he was the only man alive who knew how to stop it. If you love stories about quiet competence crushing corporate arrogance, stick around for this one. The rain was falling hard enough that the road between Orion Township and Auburn Hills had become a river of reflected taillights, each car crawling forward at a speed that felt more like waiting than driving. And Charlie Parker had his arm elbow deep in the engine bay of a 2003 Lincoln Town car that someone had decided should stop running at exactly the wrong moment. He found the wire by touch before he found it by sight, a thin strand of copper that did not belong to the factory harness, spliced into the fuel pump relay line and running toward a small digital module taped to the inner fender well, the way a person might tape a spare key to the underside of a porch step and forget it is there. He worked the board loose with his fingers, careful not to short anything against the chassis, and held it up to the dim light from his headlamp. It was a digital trigger with an integrated GPS receiver, its surface mount components designed with precision, programmed to wait until the vehicle's speed dropped low enough to cut the fuel line safely. It was meant to be invisible, and it was meant to be deniable. He pulled the anti-static bag from the glove box of his truck and sealed the board inside, folding the bag over twice the way you fold a letter you do not want anyone else to read. The woman in the driver's seat had not moved. She sat with both hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the rain as though she had all the time in the world and had chosen to spend some of it here, on a dark road, waiting for a stranger to fix what someone had broken. "Left my phone at home," she said when he leaned down to the window. "On purpose. My daughter's company has this VIP line 24-hour roadside assistance, and I told her I did not want it. They send a tow truck and a rental car and a form to sign. And by the time you are done with all of that, you have given up your whole evening. I would rather sit here." Charlie did not argue with her. He offered to call a tow and she declined. He stepped back to the engine bay, pulled the wire strippers from his pocket, and twisted the bare copper ends of the severed fuel pump wires tightly together, sealing them with black electrical tape to close the circuit. He stood back in the rain and signaled her to turn the key. The engine caught on the first try the way a car does when a mechanic understands exactly how the machine breathes. She thanked him and drove off into the rain, and he watched the taillights disappear into the crawl of traffic before he got back into his truck. Earlier that evening, before any of it, he had been standing in the open bay door of Parker Motor Works, watching a night shift nurse count out cash from a worn wallet into her palm. She was short by $42. She knew it before she finished counting, and he knew it before she told him. And when she looked up with the kind of apology that people practice in their heads on the drive over, he told her to bring the rest when she had it. She nodded once, quick, the way people nod when they are trying not to show how much a small kindness means, and drove away in the minivan he had just finished tightening the final bolts on. The garage was quiet after she left. The rain had not started yet, but the air smelled like it would. He came back through the bay door with the bag's circuit board in his pocket and walked past the lift and the tool chests to the workbench at the back of the shop, where the heavy metal drawer sat half open the way it always sat, never quite closed all the way because the tracks were bent from years of use. He opened it the rest of the way and dropped the landlord's final notice into the drawer, placing it among the unpaid bills and the spare car key, and the fuse box and the photograph of Laurel and the small metal calibration reference standard that he had kept for reasons he no longer remembered clearly. The drawer closed with the sound of metal on metal, and he stood there for a moment with his hand on the handle before he walked to the front office. Lucy was sitting at the desk with her homework spread across the surface, her jacket pulled tight around her shoulders because the heater was running on one element again, the second coil glowing orange while the third stayed dark and cold. She looked up when he came in, and then she looked past him through the glass at the minivan waiting in the bay, the one with the patched-up brake lines and the replaced caliper, and the nurse's $42 balance still unpaid. "If it can still get someone home," she said, "then it is not useless." He nodded. He did not turn it into a lesson, did not say anything about the nurse or the money or the landlord's notice in the drawer. He just stood there in the doorway of the cold office and looked at the minivan the way you look at something you have fixed, knowing it will hold. Later, after Lucy had gone to bed and the garage was dark except for the single light above the workbench, he sat down and pulled the anti-static bag from his pocket and laid the circuit board flat on the metal surface under the harsh shop light. He studied the board the way he had studied every board he had ever found in a car that was not supposed to be there, tracing the traces with his eyes, reading the logic of the components the way other men read a map. The soldering was clean, professional, done by someone who knew what they were doing. The chip at the center of the board was connected to a small capacitor and a resistor in a configuration that he recognized immediately. It was a self-destruct sequence, a pulse designed to burn the memory chip and leave behind the physical signature of a relay that had shorted out naturally, the kind of failure that any mechanic would write off as a part that had simply reached the end of its life. He had seen this exact design philosophy before. He set the plastic bag down on the metal bench, alone in the quiet garage, and did not say a word. The Caldwell Meridian campus rose out of the morning fog, all glass and steel that had never been touched by a greased rag or a worn socket. Charlie stood at the security gate in his work clothes, the fabric of his jacket still holding the smell of the garage, and watched the people pass through the turnstiles with their badge scans and their quick nods to the guard. "This is my guest," Vivian Caldwell said, arriving at the gate with the authority of someone who had never needed to raise her voice. "Escorted visitor. I will sign for him." The guard handed Charlie a temporary badge with the word visitor printed across the front. Vivian met him in the lobby, carrying a sealed envelope, and handed him a pre-provisioned IT smart card without slowing her pace. Charlie hung the badge around his neck without ceremony and followed Vivian into the building. They walked through corridors of brushed steel, past conference rooms where people sat around tables studying screens, past offices where the filing was digital and nothing ever dripped oil on the floor. Charlie kept his hands in his pockets. The Meridian 1 engineering lab was a large, open room at the end of the longest corridor, filled with the hum of servers and the glow of monitors arranged around a central display wall. A dozen people stood or sat at various stations, looking up when Vivian entered. "Wesley," Vivian said, and a man in his early 50s with silver hair stepped forward. "This is the contractor I mentioned. He is going to take a look at the fault." Wesley Hart shook Charlie's hand quickly. "We have been running the simulation for 3 weeks. The fault appears at random intervals in the tertiary pressure delivery sequence." Charlie did not respond. He walked to the whiteboard on the far wall, picked up a marker, and wrote 3 lines of kernel-level command syntax, an obsolete string of overrides that had not been documented in a decade. He wrote quickly, his hand moving with the muscle memory of a man signing his own name. When he finished, he stepped back. An engineer standing near the monitors studied the syntax and shook his head. "That logic is too old for the Meridian 1 architecture. We retired that fallback path in the 2nd generation." The simulation on the main monitors began to destabilize. Numbers on the screen climbed past their safe thresholds, and the engineer turned back to his station with the quick, focused movements of a man trying to catch a falling glass. He entered a modern API call, but the numbers kept climbing. "Type what is on the board," Charlie said. "Now." The engineer hesitated for half a second, then typed the exact command line override Charlie had written. The numbers stopped climbing, held steady for a moment, and began to descend into the safe range. The system did not crash. Wesley Hart was already composing the incident report on his tablet. Charlie watched him from across the room and saw the way he filed the report under the team's name, deliberately omitting the name of the man who had written the solution on the whiteboard. At the back of the room, Mallory Keene was watching Charlie with an expression that did not match the rest of the room. She was noting something down on her tablet, a brief entry in her compliance log, and when she finished, she closed the cover and said nothing. She had seen the way Charlie wrote that sequence. It was not the way a contractor writes a workaround. It was the way a man writes something he knows by heart. She kept the observation to herself. Vivienne pulled Charlie into a small glass-walled office adjacent to the lab and closed the door. She set a vendor onboarding packet on the table between them and slid a pen across the surface. "We need you to sign the NDA before we can proceed," she said. "Standard terms, protects our intellectual property." Charlie picked up the packet and read it slowly, turning each page with the deliberate attention he gave to a wiring diagram. He reached the restrictive publication clause and read it twice. "All findings must pass through legal before disclosure," he said. "That is a gag clause." "It is standard procedure," Vivienne said. Charlie pushed the pen back across the surface. "I do not sign agreements that control what I can say about my own work." Vivienne's expression hardened, reading his refusal as proof he was hiding something. She picked up the packet and set it aside. She did not ask him to reconsider. She simply looked at him for a long moment, then stood and walked to the door, holding it open for him to leave. The pre-launch milestone review was held in a boardroom on the top floor, a long table of polished wood surrounded by chairs that cost more than the tools in Charlie's garage. Conrad Voss sat at the head of the table, his hands folded on the surface in front of him, his face carrying the patience of a man who has been waiting longer than he intended to wait. Vivienne sat across from him, her tablet open to the same incident report that Wesley had filed, the one that did not mention the contractor. Conrad spoke in a voice that was quiet and unhurried. "The software faults remain unresolved," he said. "The program is delayed. I am asking you directly, Vivienne, whether you are capable of delivering this product on schedule." Vivienne answered him, her voice steady, her hands still on the table, but the question hung in the air between them, and the person holding the chain was Conrad Voss. That evening, Charlie stood over the metal workbench in the quiet garage, the single light casting a harsh circle on the surface. He held his phone in one hand, the screen showing the photograph he had taken of the whiteboard sequence before he walked out of the lab. He set the phone down and picked up the anti-static bag from the corner of the bench, laying the circuit board from Baya's Lincoln flat on the metal surface next to the phone. The three-step sequence on the screen matched the logic of the board in front of him. Same methodology, same architect. He didn't say it aloud, but the silence in the garage was heavy with the answer. He stood in the light above the workbench and did not move, the photograph and the circuit board lying side by side. The classified briefing room was a quiet space, insulated from the rest of the campus by walls that absorbed sound the way a heavy curtain absorbs light. Charlie sat at the table across from Vivienne Caldwell. The first time in his career he had been treated as a peer rather than a man who fixed things, and the silence between them carried the weight of the previous evening's discovery. Vivienne leaned forward and set a folder on the table between them, her hand resting on it the way a person rests a hand on something they are not yet ready to open. "I need to understand what you saw in that simulation," she said. "Not the workaround, the logic behind it." Charlie looked at the folder. The answer was in his chest, a pressure behind his ribs. The name of the man who had written that logic, the reason he recognized the architecture the way a man recognizes his own handwriting. He did not say it. His pride rose like a wall, and he held the name inside him the way a man holds a coin in a closed fist. "It was a guess," he said. "A good one." Vivienne studied him for a long moment, her eyes moving across his face the way a person reads a page. They do not fully understand. She did not push. She closed the folder and set it aside, and the brief moment of tentative trust passed between them like a door that had been opened and then closed again. Mallory Keene sat in her office on the third floor, the compliance log open on her desk, her hands moving across the keyboard with the deliberate precision of a woman who understood that the record was the only thing that would survive the investigation. She typed the compliance hold on the pre-rehearsal test data, her fingers finding the keys with the certainty of a woman who had written this same sequence in her mind a dozen times before she ever touched the keyboard. She entered the citation under the Trade Act, the language of the statute sitting in her memory like a passage she had read so many times she no longer needed to look at the page. "Severe safety alert," she typed. and the words carried the weight of a formal accusation. She hit submit, and the hold filed itself in the secure vault, time-stamped under her name. A small stone dropped into a still pond. She sat back in her chair and looked at the screen for a long moment, her hands still resting on the keyboard, her face carrying no expression that anyone else would have recognized as satisfaction. It was not satisfaction. It was the quiet certainty of a woman who had done the only thing she could do. Everett Shaw reviewed the visitor logs from his office on the executive floor, the screen of his monitor casting a pale light across his face. He saw the name Parker, linked to the escorted visitor bypass that Vivian had authorized, and he stopped scrolling. He did not react visibly. His face remained the same neutral expression he wore in every meeting, but his hand paused over the mouse, and that pause was the only sign of recognition. He drafted the legal advisory with the same careful attention he gave to every document that crossed his desk, choosing each word the way a man chooses a tool for a specific task. This contractor refused to sign the standard NDA. He has a documented IP theft flag on his background. Under our data protection policy, he is an active data leak risk. Recommend immediate badge revocation and account suspension. He sent the advisory to the CISO in building security, and then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his chest, his hands clean, his procedure flawless. He waited a full minute before he stood and walked to Vivian's office. He stood in the doorway, his hands resting in his pockets, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in depositions. "You brought an IP theft suspect into the lab without a background check," he said. "You bypassed standard security protocol. I need you to explain what you were thinking." Vivian looked at him, and for a moment her face carried the flicker of a woman who understood that she had been outflanked. She looked down at her desk, at the folder she had placed there earlier, the one Charlie had not opened. "I approved the bypass," she said, her voice quiet. "I will approve the suspension." She signed the document without looking at it, her pen moving across the page with the mechanical precision of a woman following a procedure she could not change. Everett watched her sign, his face carrying the same expression of mild, bureaucratic regret. And then he turned and walked back to his office without another word. Charlie walked toward the campus security turnstile later that day, the temporary badge in his hand, the weight of it familiar in his palm. The rain had started to fall, a steady, quiet rain that darkened the concrete and made the lights in the lobby cast long reflections on the wet floor. He tapped the badge against the reader. The device emitted a flat, solid red light, a color that carried no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. He tapped it again, and the light remained the same shade of refusal. Through the thick security glass, he saw Everett Shaw standing in the lobby, his hands resting in his pockets, his face arranged in an expression of mild, bureaucratic regret. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a man who had made a phone call and was now watching the result. Charlie did not try the badge a third time. He turned his collar up against the rain and walked back to his truck, his footsteps carrying him away from the building. The red light still glowing on the reader behind him. Charlie stood outside the control room, the useless badge still in his hand, and watched through the thick glass as the Meridian 1 began its rehearsal run on the closed track below. Through the bank of monitors mounted on the far wall, he could see the car accelerating into the first straight, its lines clean and purposeful the way a drawn bowstring is purposeful. Wesley Hart stood at the central console. "We're running on the previous stable build," he was saying. "The compliance hold applies to the current version only. This build predates the hold by 3 release cycles." The safety operator sat at his station, his hand resting near the RF kill switch. The car approached the critical curve, the one that required precise deceleration. The safety operator hit the switch. The panel read, in calm green letters, "Vehicle stopped." The track monitors showed the car still accelerating. For a moment, the room did not move. Then the safety operator hit the switch again, and the panel continued to report a stopped vehicle while the monitors showed the car entering the curve at a speed that no driver could correct. The room collapsed into motion. Engineers shouted over each other. Wesley stood frozen at the console, his face the color of a man who had just understood the full weight of his own cleverness. Charlie pressed his palm against the glass and watched the car on the monitors, the driver fighting the wheel, the vehicle beginning to drift toward the outside wall of the curve. The door to the control room opened from the inside. Vivian Caldwell stepped through and walked past him without a word, her heels striking the concrete floor with the rhythm of a woman who had stopped thinking about consequences. She badged into the control room and pushed past the security engineer, a man who stepped aside the way a person steps aside from an approaching car. She stood over the chief engineer, a gray-haired man whose hands were still on the keyboard. "I don't care about Everett's protocol," Vivian said to the chief engineer. "Open the hardware diagnostic port. Bypass Active Directory entirely. I grant physical override." The chief engineer looked at her for a moment that carried the weight of a career decision. Then he hit the physical release for the maintenance terminal, a separate station bolted to the concrete floor near the back wall. The port's covers slid open. Charlie reached into his pocket and pulled out the calibration reference standard, the small metal rectangle he had carried since the garage. He plugged it into the bare metal diagnostic port. The terminal recognized the handshake at the hardware layer, bypassing any software certificate revocation, and logged his permanent hardware ID directly into the core log. He executed the three-step sequence: isolate, maintenance mode, return to physical actuators. On the monitors, the car's brakes engaged. The vehicle decelerated, its tires smoking against the track surface, and it came to a stop in the runoff area, its nose resting against the gravel barrier. 3 people climbed out and stood on the track, breathing hard, their hands on their knees. The control room was silent. Then someone exhaled and the room began to breathe again. Mallory Keene arrived at the track with internal security, her stride carrying her across the pavement the way a woman walks toward something she has been expecting. She reached the car, opened the trunk, and pulled out the independent data logger, a black box the size of a paperback book. She dropped it into an evidence bag and sealed it with a motion that had the finality of a door closing. Under the internal evidentiary protocol for critical incidents, safety compliance is sealing this hardware. Anyone who touches it is obstructing an investigation. Wesley opened his mouth to speak, but Mallory was already walking away, the evidence bag in her hand. In the control room, the main system rebooted. The screens went dark and then lit up again. The incident data erased, the logs overwritten. Only Charlie's hardware log entry remained. His name, his commands, the calibration standard serial number stamped in the terminal's memory, and Vivian's override, logged under her name, her cryptographic authorization, her career on the line. Everett Shaw sat in his office, the screen of his laptop casting a pale light across his face. He was not watching the security feed. He was looking at an automated IT alert that had just flashed across his screen. A bare metal hardware override had been executed using a legacy North Star certificate. He had the exact technical log he needed. He opened a draft email, attached a pre-packaged dossier he had prepared 3 days earlier, and leaked it to an anonymous, toxic industry whisper network forum where fact-checking was not required. The subject line read, "Former North Star engineer implicated in IP theft case resurfaces as contractor at Caldwell Meridian R&D." The post contained no mention of the test track incident or the near crash. It was a pure character assassination, the kind of story that traveled through the Detroit auto industry corridor the way water travels through a dry creek bed overnight. He hit send and leaned back in his chair, his face carrying the same expression of mild, bureaucratic regret he had worn when he watched Charlie walk away from the turnstile. The next morning, Charlie stood in the front office of Parker Motor Works and watched a delivery truck pull up to the garage door. The driver climbed out, a man in his 50s with a clipboard and a phone, and walked toward the office. He held up his phone, the screen showing the blog post from the night before. "Boss read the news, says it's too risky right now. Cash on delivery or nothing." Charlie looked at the phone, at the headline that carried his name and his history, and walked to the cash drawer. He counted out the bills and handed them to the driver the way a man hands over something he knows he will not get back. The driver counted the money, nodded once, and walked back to the truck. The phone rang 3 times that morning. Each call was the same. A client, apologetic, citing concerns about the article. canceling an appointment. Charlie listened to each one, said the same words, and hung up the phone the way a man sets down a weight he cannot carry. The landlord called at 11. His voice carried the same careful distance. The deadline is still the deadline. I can't extend it again. Charlie said he understood. Lucy came home from school at 3:30. She walked through the front door of the office, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face carrying the careful blankness of a child who has learned to hide what she feels. Charlie noticed the school tag on her jacket first. The Parker name had been folded over. The fabric creased where she had pressed it down. The name no longer visible. She stood in the doorway and asked the question the way a child asks a question she already knows the answer to. If the garage goes away, do we have to move away from here? Charlie looked at her, at the folded name on her tag, at the way her hands hung at her sides, the way a person's hands hang when they have stopped hoping for something. He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to promise her that the garage would survive, that the article would fade, that the landlord would wait, that they would stay in the same house with the same walls and the same light in the kitchen. But he had spent his life telling the truth, and he could not stop now. I don't know, he said. He looked at her, at the folded name on her tag, and felt the immense, crushing weight of what his honesty had cost them. I could have stayed out of that control room, Charlie said, his voice quiet in the cold office. I could have kept quiet, kept the contract, and saved this garage. But Lucy, if you let a machine hurt people just to protect your own roof, then the roof isn't worth standing under anymore. Lucy looked at him for a long moment. She did not cry. She nodded, her face carrying the quiet strength of her mother. I know, she said. She walked past him into the back room, and Charlie stood alone in the front office, the phone silent on the desk, the coffee cold in his hand. The garage was quiet. The phone had stopped ringing hours ago, the silence heavier than the cancellations. Charlie sat at the desk in the front office, watching the single orange element of the space heater glow in the dark. Beside it, the taped note still read, "Dad will fix this Saturday." He had not fixed it, and as he sat in the cold, he understood the full, absolute weight of what he could not fix. 48 hours later, Charlie Parker sat in a boardroom at Caldwell Meridian in a chair that cost more than the monthly rent on the garage, and watched the people who had erased his name from their records open a folder that contained the truth of what they had done. The room was large and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when people have stopped pretending they are not afraid. The safety committee sat along one side of the long table, their faces carrying the careful neutrality of people who have been told to wait for the facts. Outside counsel occupied the far end, a woman in a charcoal suit and a man in wire-rimmed glasses, their laptops open. The executive team sat across from the committee, Conrad Voss at the center, his face carrying a faint composure. Everett Shaw beside him, his hands folded on the table. Vivian Caldwell at the far end, her eyes fixed on the center of the table. And Wesley Hart near the door, his face pale, his fingers tapping a rhythm against his thigh that only he could hear. Charlie sat at the foot of the table, the same chair he had sat in when they had told him his contract was terminated. He had not been asked to speak. He had been asked to witness the evidence as it was opened, to hear his name spoken aloud in the room where it had been erased. Mallory Keene stood first. She walked to the front of the room, a tablet in her hand, her posture carrying deliberate precision. She did not look at the executive team. She looked at the safety committee, at the outside counsel, at the lead forensic investigator from the independent audit firm. Mallory spoke for a short time, her voice steady and measured. She summarized the timeline of the rushed rehearsal, the compliance hold data she had secured, and the Bea device information she had preserved. She did not accuse anyone. She presented the facts plainly, and when she finished, she sat down. The lead forensic investigator stood. She adjusted her glasses and looked at the room. "The comprehensive forensic report will take 6 months," she said. Her voice was calm and unhurried, but 48 hours was enough to analyze the payload in Miss Keene's snapshot and cross-reference the digital certificate from Mr. Parker's hardware intervention. "It is a match. This is sufficient basis for the board to act." She opened the first piece of evidence. A screen at the front of the room displayed the independent data logger's CAN bus recording, the physical log that Mallory had seized at the scene. The data scrolled across the screen, lines of hexadecimal code that told a story the room could read. The back door was active before Charlie's intervention. His maintenance commands had returned control to the driver. The recording showed the moment the exploit was triggered, the moment the system failed, the moment the car stopped. It showed the truth of what had happened, written in the language of the machine itself. Conrad Voss did not move. His face carried the composure of a man who has already calculated his next move. The investigator opened the second piece of evidence. Mallory's compliance hold snapshot appeared on the screen, a digital photograph of the system state before the rehearsal. The Hartwell contractor's exploit was present in the previous stable build that Wesley had chosen to run. The data traced back through a shared service account, through vendor payment records, through a chain of digital signatures that led to a name the room knew. Wesley stopped tapping his fingers. His hand went still on his thigh. The investigator opened the third piece of evidence. The calibration reference standard's digital handshake appeared on the screen, a unique signature authenticated entirely at the hardware layer, bypassing the software revocation that had locked Charlie out a decade ago. The signature traced back to the bare metal North Star project files, to the files now owned by Caldwell Meridian after the acquisition. The data identified Charlie Parker as the calibration clearance holder, the original architect of the safety watchdog, the man who had built the system that had stopped the car. Outside counsel leaned forward, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. The FBI has been notified regarding the payload origin. Hartwell's executives are being deposed as we speak. The room turned. The safety committee looked at Charlie. Outside counsel looked at him. The forensic investigator looked at him, her face carrying no surprise, only the quiet recognition of a fact that had been waiting to be spoken. "You are the original architect of the safety watchdog," the investigator said. It was not a question. Charlie did not answer. He did not need to. The data on the screen spoke for him. The truth of what he had built waiting in the files that no one had thought to read. Conrad Voss leaned back in his chair. Everett Shaw's hands were still folded on the table, but his knuckles were white. The blood drained from his fingers the way the blood drains from a face when the body knows it has been caught. Bea Caldwell sat at the side of the room, her hands folded in her lap. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence in the room was the evidence that the room could not ignore, the witness to the human cost of what had been done. Vivienne Caldwell stood up. She did not wait for the board to ask. She did not wait for the investigator to finish. She stood the way a person stands when they have decided that the only thing left to do is tell the truth. And she looked at the room, at the faces of the people who had watched Charlie walk out of the contractor entrance. "I misjudged him," she said. Her voice was steady. "My procedures erased his name. My caution cost him his livelihood. I halted the testing. I secured the data. I am responsible for what happened to him." She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not offer an excuse. She named what she had done, plainly, publicly. The room was silent. Outside counsel turned to Charlie. The woman in the charcoal suit leaned forward, her face carrying the careful neutrality of a person who is about to ask a question that will change the shape of the room. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice quiet, deliberate, "do you believe that Miss Caldwell was complicit in the conspiracy that led to the crisis on the test track?" The question hung in the air like a held breath in a room full of people who were waiting for the answer. Charlie looked at Vivienne. She was sitting now, her hands flat on the table in front of her, her face carrying the expression of a person who has already accepted the worst outcome. He could end her career. He could say the words that would destroy her, the way her decisions had destroyed him. The room was waiting for him to do it. He did not. "Miss Caldwell misjudged me," he said. His voice was quiet. "Her decisions caused real consequences, but she is not part of the fraud." He paused. The room waited. "Mistakes must be fixed," he said. "Fraud must be investigated. Those two things should not be called by the same name just because revenge is easier." The room exhaled. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound of shoulders dropping, of hands unclenching, of the air moving out of lungs that had been holding it for longer than anyone in the room had realized. The tension that had been coiled in the room since the first piece of evidence was opened broke with the quiet release of something that has been held too long. Charlie stood up from the table. He did not look at Conrad. He did not look at Everett. He looked at Vivienne once, the way a person looks at someone they have forgiven without being asked, and then he walked to the door. The room let him go. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the parking lot. The late afternoon sun was warm against his face, a bright golden light that stretched across the pavement. He took a deep breath of air that did not smell like ozone or server racks, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed the number. "Hey," he said when she answered. "I will be home before dinner." The next morning, Charlie sat across from Vivienne Caldwell in her office on the top floor of the Caldwell Meridian building. Vivienne pushed 3 documents across the desk, one at a time, the way a person lays out the evidence of something completed. "The human testing protocol is frozen, pending an independent audit," she said. "The audit team reports to the safety committee, not to program leadership." She pushed the second document forward. "Your North Star record has been corrected in the public database. The correction notice is published." She pushed the third document forward. "The safety reporting channel is live. It routes directly to the safety committee. Legal does not review the submissions." Charlie looked at the 3 documents without touching them. Vivienne pulled a 4th document from the drawer. "I would like you to join the company as Vice President of Safety Systems," she said. "You would have full authority over the testing protocols and the engineering standards." Charlie did not touch the contract. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I am not an executive. I am a mechanic. When a mechanic makes a mistake, a car crashes and people get hurt. When an executive makes a mistake, they just rewrite the protocol and blame the contractor. I need my hands on the things that actually matter." He pushed the contract back across the desk. Vivienne nodded, a slow movement that carried no surprise, accepting the truth in his words. She pulled out a second contract, thinner than the first. "Independent safety consultant," she said. "You report to the safety committee. Your reports go directly to them. The contract cannot be terminated for an unfavorable finding. I have authorized a signing advance from the operational budget. It will be deposited today." Charlie read the contract slowly and signed it. Vivienne took the contract, initialed the signature page, and placed it in the drawer. She did not shake his hand. She looked at him with the quiet attention of someone who has wronged another and tried to make it right. 3 hours later, Charlie stood in the front office of Parker Motor Works holding an escrow letter signed by Vivienne Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Meridian. The landlord stood across the desk with his arms crossed. Charlie laid the letter on the desk. "Back rent, plus 6 months in advance. The wire transfer clears tomorrow morning, guaranteed by $1 billion legal department." The landlord picked up the letter, looked at the seal, looked at Charlie, and folded it into his shirt pocket. He nodded once and left without a word. The front door opened and a young mother walked in, carrying a toddler on her hip. Through the glass, Charlie could see a 10-year-old sedan parked outside, 2 child seats visible in the back. "The brakes are grinding," she said, her voice tight with the kind of stress that comes from knowing how much things cost. "I only have $40 until Friday." Charlie walked out to the car, checked the calipers, and came back inside. "The left pad is gone," he said. "I'll replace both front pads now so you can drive safely." He did not look at her wallet. "We'll figure out the rest next week." He pulled on his old work jacket and walked through the door into the work bays. Later that afternoon, Lucy walked in from school. She carried a large cardboard box in both arms, setting it down on the desk with a heavy thud. She opened the box and pulled out a brand new space heater, purchased with her saved allowance. She plugged it in and turned the dial, the fresh elements immediately glowing a steady, bright orange. She stopped just inside the warm air, her face lifting with the surprise of it. She did not need to fix the old one anymore. She looked down at her school jacket, at the tag sewn into the inside seam. The tag had been folded for months, the name hidden against the lining. She unfolded it. She smoothed the crease with her thumb until the name Parker was fully visible. She looked out through the glass into the work bays. Charlie was standing beside the car on the lift, his old work jacket dark against the fluorescent lights, his hands moving over the engine. Lucy turned to the corner where the old broken heater sat unplugged. She peeled off the old tape note, the one that said "Dad will fix this Saturday" in her own handwriting. She carried it to the shelf beside the new heater and placed it inside a small frame beside the North Star exoneration letter. She sat down at the desk, the warmth of the new heater against her legs, and opened her homework notebook. She wrote a single line across the top of the page. A thing isn't valuable because of what people call it. It's valuable because it gets someone home. She looked out at the work bays, at her father standing beside the old sedan with the child seats, working in the place he had chosen. The garage was quiet. The three elements of the heater glowed steady and orange against the afternoon shadows. For the first time in a long time, it felt like home.